Well, hello everybody. I'm Kenny Bailey with the Cumberland County Center of North Carolina Cooperative Extension, and today I want to talk with you about growing homegrown tomatoes. But first of all, if you excuse me guys, this is my normal lunch break and I'm hungry, so just bear with me just for a minute. Man, I got my bread here. Oh, this is gonna be great, guys. Look at there, got my fresh bread. Good old fresh bread. Got my mayonnaise here, so I got to put some mayonnaise on that bread. Oh man, this is gonna be good. Look at that. Got my mayonnaise. Oh, well, you look here, guys. You see this, guys? Oh man, isn't that beautiful? Look at that, man. Oh, this is gonna be good. I bet y'all wish you were here with me. Share this with me. Oh man. Oh man, look at that. Isn't that beautiful? And put that on the bread there. Y'all excuse me. Oh, gotta have my salt and pepper. There we go, good old salt and pepper. Now this is gonna be great, guys. Yes sir, buddy. Gotta have lots of pepper on it. Y'all excuse me, man. I haven't eaten all day. Let me take that bite of that beautiful sandwich here. Man, I didn't expect that. Guys, give me just a second. Oh. Man. I'd have been just as well off to cut me a piece of cardboard and paint it red and put it on that sandwich. Man, that tomato, that's what it tastes like. Cardboard. Doesn't have any taste. Wow. That's disappointing, guys. Y'all ever had that happen before? This time of year when you buy store-bought tomatoes out of season and you go to eat that tomato and it just is tasteless. Well, there's a couple reasons behind that, and I want to point that out to you. First of all, here in North Carolina, this is not tomato season. We don't have tomatoes coming off at this time, unless you're buying from somebody that grows greenhouse tomatoes, and you can get them fresh picked that way. But most of our tomatoes we see now that's in the stores have come either out of Florida, Texas, California, maybe even as far away as South America, and they've been picked like this. If you see this green tomato, they've been picked like that so that they can go through the shipping process, and then once they get to the distribution point where they're going to be sold or where they're going to be distributed to the local markets, they're then exposed to ethylene gas in order to turn them red like this. So that's why tomatoes that are grown out of the state of North Carolina, not grown locally, grown in the wrong time, coming out time of the year that we don't get locally grown tomatoes, they taste bad because it's not been allowed to ripen on the vine before they were picked. And in addition to that, a lot of the varieties that are used in commercial tomato production are not developed for their taste or developed for how well they hold up during the shipping and marketing phase. And the other thing is they're just not that homegrown tomato that everybody who enjoys tomatoes knows about. The difference between homegrown tomatoes and those that are bought that are grown in other parts of the world or grown off in the distance. And that's one of the reasons we want to do this talk here today is many people know the benefits of growing their own tomatoes, and they know the joys of it, and they know the difference between the flavor of a store-bought tomato versus a homegrown tomato. And today we want to show you and talk to you about how to be successful at growing on your own tomatoes. This is one of the reasons why tomatoes are by far the most popular vegetable that's grown in the vegetable garden, in the home garden. And so today, there's nothing like that homegrown tomato, and we want to give you some tips to help you be successful with growing in your own tomatoes. So what we're going to talk about today, first of all, just a little bit about the history of tomatoes. Then we're going to talk about site selection and where you want to make sure you got the right site for growing your tomatoes. Talk about fertilizing and soil testing, planting, supporting and training your tomatoes, proper watering, harvesting, and variety selection. And finally, we'll talk about a few of the problems that you'll want to run into and be aware of so that you can have more success in growing your own tomatoes. So let's dive right in here. The tomatoes that we have today are derived from wild tomatoes that grew in South America. And one interesting thing about tomatoes, at one point, tomatoes were thought to be poisonous. And for the longest time, even though tomatoes arrived from the American continent, it was actually the Europeans that first made tomatoes popular. They were eating tomatoes a long time before Americans were. The reason they were thought to be poisonous is because tomatoes are a member of the nightshade family. When nightshade plants from that family do have toxins in them, and if you eat the fruit of those, they are poisonous. But that's not the case with the tomato. But it took a long time before Americans determined that tomatoes were not poisonous, and it became the popular fruit that it is today. So that's an interesting tidbit about a tomato. So let's dive into what we need to do to get some good tomatoes. First of all, let's talk about our site selection. When you're selecting a site to grow tomatoes, you need to be in an area where you can get at least 6 hours of sunlight every day. Now, there's really no way of getting around that. If you're getting less than 6 hours a day, you're not going to do that very well at growing tomatoes. It takes that much sunlight to develop a good quality fruit. So you need to try to find an area in your yard. If you're doing it in the yard, or if you're doing it on the patio in pots, find an area that it can get at least 6 hours of sunlight during the course of the day. It also needs to be grown in a well-drained area. If you're having drainage problems in your garden, your tomatoes are not going to do well. They don't like wet feet. They're highly susceptible to root rot and other problems that come along with wet soils. So you need to do something about the drainage in your area. If it's a situation where you can't, you may want to look into doing raised bed gardening or growing them in pots. But nonetheless, you need to make sure that your plants are growing in well-drained soil. Also needs to be well ventilated, which means we need to make sure that we got good wind currents blowing through the area that it's growing in. Things that can prevent good ventilation in the yard include fences and fence rows, shade trees, shrubbery that might block the wind from blowing through that tomato plant canopy. We want to keep those leaves as dry as we possibly can, because moisture on the leaves sets the plant up for disease issues. So, as well as the fruit needs to be well ventilated. So we want to make sure that we got good ventilation. We also, along the ventilation line, want to be careful not to plant our tomatoes too close to one another. And I'll talk a little bit in just a minute about the spacing of our tomato plantings. Should be also close to a water source, because good, even watering of our tomato plants is integral to having success. So you need to make sure that it is close to a water source. And finally, wherever you're going to grow your tomatoes, they need to be convenient convenient so that you can check on them on a regular basis as well when it comes time to harvest, and you've got to walk out to the back 40 to get them. So you want to keep them up there close by the house. Most people like to have it close to the kitchen where they can go out and gather a tomato if they want to eat it for supper that night. So keep it in a good, convenient location. So a good site is one that has good sunlight, 6 hours a day, well drained, close to a water source, and convenient to the one who's growing and picking the tomatoes. The next thing we want to address is fertilizing our tomatoes. And before we talk about fertilizing, prior to fertilizing and prior to planting your tomatoes or preparing your garden, if at all possible, you need to have a soil test done. Now, North Carolina Department of Agriculture does provide soil testing. You can get the soil testing kits through us, the Cooperative Extension, with instructions on how to collect the sample and prepare it. You can bring it back to us. We'll get it to the lab for you. Once the report is ready, we can help you interpret the results. But this soil test analysis is a key element of having a successful tomato growing, because two things we want to look at in the soil test. One is the pH, and that pH needs to be corrected if it's out of whack. Tomatoes prefer a soil pH of between 6.5 and 6.7. You're going to get your best results in that pH range, and the only way to know it is to have the soil test done. The second thing that the soil test will tell you is what type of fertilizer you need and how much. So those two items there, soil pH, if the pH is too low, there will be a recommendation to put out lime and how much to put out. If the pH is too high, then that's when you need to call our office and we can help you determine the best ways to bring that pH down into the range that it needs. And then, of course, fertilize according to the soil test report. Now, okay, in the absence of a soil test, there is you don't have to wait for that if you've gotten into a situation where it's too late to take the test in time for this planting season. In the absence of a soil test, we recommend that that you apply a half a cup of a complete fertilizer, such as 888 or 10-10-10. Thoroughly mix that into the soil in the area where you're going to plant it, as well as about a cup of lime in that same area. In the absence of a soil test, that will provide you roughly what you need to give it the proper fertility, as well as to reduce some of the issues that improper pH can handle. So if you're going to do that, half a cup of 888 or half a cup of 10-10-10 and about a cup of lime, mix it thoroughly into the planting area, and then you can plant it. And then starting at about 4 weeks, about every 4 to 6 weeks, after you've planted that plant, go back and put about 2 to 3 tablespoons of either the 888 or 10-10-10, or 2 to 3 tablespoons of the fertilizer that your soil test recommends. Put that about 4 to 6 inches away from the plant, and do that about every 4 to 6 weeks during the growing season, and you should sufficiently have the amount of nutrient that plant needs to do well. So when it comes to planting tomatoes, there's 2 ways you can go about planting tomatoes. You can either plant transplants, or you can direct seed in the ground. But you do want to wait until after the danger of frost or freeze is passed for our area. Here in the Cumberland County area, the date of our average last frost or freeze is around April 7th or April 8th. Give a day or two either way. Tomatoes are not tolerant to frost and freeze. It's a warm season crop, and so we want to put it out there after the danger of frost is passed. Now, You can buy transplants from a garden center, or you may want to produce your own transplants indoors. If you're going to do that, you want to plant your seed so that at around the time that you're going to plant the transplants, that the transplant's about 6 to 8 weeks old. That's the ideal age of a transplant to put in the ground. When you do plant your transplants, you want to plant them as deeply as you can in the ground, while at the same time making sure that the foliage on the plant doesn't touch the soil. If the foliage touches the soil, it can allow leaf spot diseases and other disease pathogens to get onto the foliage and cause problems. If you have some rather large plants and it's impractical to dig a deep hole to plant these transplants, you can do what we call the trench method, which means that you dig a trench and lay in the root ball of the transplant on one end and laying the plant down in the trench and turning the tip up and covering the plant that's in the trench. The reason we recommend that, as well as deep planting and transplants, is because wherever the soil comes in contact with that tomato plant stem, they're going to develop roots. And the more roots, the stronger the root system you can produce on that plant, the more successful you're going to be at growing tomatoes. The more yield you can get, the larger, more quality fruit that you can get. Of course, we recommend about an 18 to 24 inch spacing between plants. You don't want to get any closer than that because they can encroach one another and can reduce the potential yield and quality of the plants. 18 to 24 is what we found works pretty good with tomatoes. And finally, after planting, you're going to want to water those plants in with a starter solution. When I mean a starter solution, that's some type of soluble fertilizer that you can buy mixed with the water, and water that in with that fertilizer solution. You can get that from any garden center or ag supply store, and just follow the directions on the label for how to mix that starter solution. So after you have planted your tomatoes and they've come up, they've been in there probably about the 3 to 4 week period, you want to look at getting these tomato plants off of the ground by either staking them or trellising them or caging them. Your tomatoes are going to do better if they're kept off of the ground. If left to their own, they're going to sprawl on the ground, and that's going to leave fruit on the ground that can rot and have bad spots, and just you're not going to have a quality tomato. A couple of ways that home gardeners can go about supporting and training their tomatoes. One is they can use stakes. You can buy garden stakes from the garden center or agri supply store, but you can do just as well. Go into the lumber store and get some 1x2s, cut them to about 6 feet in length. You want to have about a 5 foot stake when you're done, leaving about a foot to go into the ground to give you good support. Once you got the stakes there, you're going to want to tie a string, or you can use something like a nylon hose. Tie that to the stake, and then after you've tied it to the stake to make sure that it doesn't fall down, then you're going to tie it loosely around the tomato plant so that we don't girdle that tomato plant. And about every foot of height, you're going to want to tie your tomato plant up to keep it upright and off the ground. That's one way you can go about it. Some people like to cage their tomatoes, so you can get something like this hog wire or concrete reinforcement wire and make about an 18-inch wide ring with it. Whatever type of wire that you use, make sure that it's got big enough openings as you reach in there and grab your tomatoes. You don't want to use something like chicken wire that has small openings that you can't reach in there. Make sure that you got a big enough opening to go in there and get your hands on your tomatoes. I'm going to talk about two different types of tomato varieties in just a minute: determinate varieties and indeterminate varieties. Determinate varieties lend themselves very well to staking, whereas your indeterminate varieties do very well in the cage system, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. At the same time, though, that you're going to be training and staking and caging your tomatoes, you're also going to want to go in there and sucker those tomatoes, depending on what you want to do. First of all, let me define what a sucker is on a tomato. Let's use my forefinger and thumb as an example. My forefinger is the main stalk of a tomato, and my thumb is a leaf that's coming off that tomato plant. A sucker is a little shoot that starts to come between the angle of the leaf and the main plant. That sucker, if left alone, is going to grow, and it's going to start competing with the other suckers on the plant, as well as the whole plant by itself, taking energy off of one another that would otherwise be put into the fruit. Now, as a rule of thumb, we want to get those suckers off, just remove them off before they get to be about 3 inches long. If you do proper suckering, you're going to get larger tomato fruit, which is what most people are after. But now, if you're not all that concerned about large fruit, you can leave those suckers on and you'll get more fruit. It just won't be the large fruit that a lot of people are after. And what I found is that over the years, if you're doing steak tomatoes, determinate varieties with a good suckering program do real well on steaks. But if you're not going to sucker and you're going to use an indeterminate variety, caging those tomatoes might be the best way to go. So we talked about training and supporting the tomatoes and suckering. Let's talk about watering. The watering is very critical. Proper watering, let me say, is very critical to being successful at growing tomatoes. And the key is to do even watering, not let the plants go into extremes of drought or overwatering. So the key is even watering. In the beginning, when we plant our tomatoes in the ground, for the first few weeks, those tomatoes need about 1 inch of water per week. And that should take in consideration not only your irrigation water, but as well as rainfall. We want to take that in consideration. If we've had a lot of rain, then it's not necessary for us to go out there and waste water by irrigating ourselves. When it starts fruiting, though, we need to move that up to about 1.5 inches of water per week. Now, we don't want to put all that water out at one time. And how often you put water out depends on your soil type. If you've got, say, a heavy clay with a lot of organic matter in your soil that holds water readily, you're probably going to want to split that up into 2 waterings per week. Whereas you've got a sandy soil, you're going to want to break that watering up into 4 or 5 waterings per week. But the main thing is you want the plant to have the water it needs when it needs it and no more. Again, keep being consistent, keeping everything even is what is the key to reducing some of the issues that we have with tomatoes. If at all possible, we want to avoid overhead watering. And when I talk about overhead watering, I'm talking about watering with a overhead sprinkler. If at all possible, you want to make sure all your watering takes place by going directly to the ground. You can do this by using some type of soaker hose or drip irrigation system, or just making sure that when you do give it water that you direct that water to the ground and not overhead. As I mentioned earlier, moisture on the foliage results in disease issues, and we want to keep as much moisture off those tomato plant leaves as we possibly can. So now we've gone through the season, we've planted, we've trained, we've pruned, we've fertilized, we've watered properly. Now it comes time to harvest. How do we know when a tomato is ready to harvest? Now for most people, you're going to want to do what we call vine ripened tomatoes. Now, but vine ripening doesn't necessarily mean that it looks like this before you harvest it. It doesn't have to wait till it gets that red before you harvest it. Technically, a vine ripened tomato, if you look at some of these greener type here, this one I have in my hand is what we call in the commercial industry mature green. It is a green tomato, and it was picked before it had a chance to turn any colors on the vine. Most of your tomatoes that you're getting at this time of the year in the stores have been picked as mature green, shipped here. Once they got to the distribution point, they were exposed to ethylene gas, and that's why they look like this in the grocery store right now. Vine ripening, though, all that means is that the plant, the fruit was allowed to just turn a little bit like this one has on the vine before it was picked. As long as it has started turning its color while it's on the vine, it will continue to ripen till it gets to the ripening stage that you want it. What we recommend is if you go out there in your own garden, at least let there be a little bit of a color change on the blossom end of the tomato before you pick it off, and then leave it out of the refrigerator until it's the ripeness that you desire. And then once you put it in the refrigerator, it will last another 7 to 10 days. But don't put it in the refrigerator until it has ripened to what you desire it to be. Otherwise, it's not going to get to that point. So that's basically how we tell when it's ready to be harvested. Let's talk a little bit about variety selection, and there's so many different varieties out there of tomatoes. If I had $1 for every tomato variety that's available out there in the industry, I would be rich at this point. So you got a wide range of varieties to check for or to select from. Some of them do well here, some of them don't. Some of them have different characteristics that we are concerned about. There's a few I'm going to recommend that as a beginner that you start with if you've never grown tomatoes before, and once you've gotten experience with, you can get away from some of these varieties. But we can classify tomato varieties in very different ways. The first one I've already talked about here is determinate versus indeterminate. What is the difference between a determinate variety and an indeterminate variety? A determinate variety is one of those varieties that terminates its growth at about the 4 to 5 foot height. Once it gets to that point, it's going to do very little, if any, growing from that point. But an indeterminate variety will get to 8 feet, and in some cases, if conditions are good, will continue to grow in length. So that's determinate versus indeterminate. Then we have hybrids, which are crosses. These varieties are crosses between different varieties of plants. We have open pollinated or heirloom varieties that are some of the older varieties that your grandparents may have or your parents may have grown that you've heard about. As a rule of thumb, your hybrid varieties are more resistant to pests and diseases, while your open pollinated or heirloom varieties have less resistance to pests and diseases. But I'm going to tell you right now, don't let that deter you. At least later on, as you gain some knowledge in growing tomatoes, you're going to want to look at some of these other varieties. Then we have large tomato varieties, medium size, small size, salad types, grape tomatoes, and our whole range of colors from red to purples to pinks, yellows, and striped varieties, even from that point. So just what should I be starting with if I'm growing tomatoes for the first time? Here in this area, we recommend some old standbys here, or reliable varieties for this area. Some of those include the determinate type, Pick Red, Mountain Pride, Sunny, Colonial, just to name a few determinate varieties. And then if you're doing indeterminate varieties, Big Boy or Better Boy Hybrid, Fantastic, just a few varieties that will do well for the beginner in the beginning. Later on, as you get advanced to growing tomatoes, you may want to venture out in some of the heirloom varieties, simply because not only do we have different colors and different characteristics of tomatoes, but we have different flavors. A wide range of flavors out there in tomatoes that you can experience, and you need to go into some of these heirloom varieties if you're going to experience that flavor change. Some examples of heirlooms that you've probably heard of that your parents and grandparents may have grown include the Cherokee Purple, German Johnson, Homestead, just to name a few of these different type varieties. So later on, you're going to want to try some of these different types. Now, one of the nice things about heirloom varieties, open pollinated, is you can save those seed, and those seed will come true to type to the variety that you're growing. You can't do that with hybrid varieties, because you don't know what kind of tomato you're going to get if you save your hybrid varieties seed. Before we leave variety selection, if you're looking through a seed catalog and you're reading up on some of the varieties, some of those names may have some letters that look like a code that comes after the name, and it really is. That's what it is. It's a code. Let's say, for example, you're looking at a variety called Better Boy VFN. What does that VFN mean? Well, the V in that refers to verticillium wilt, which is a wilt disease of tomatoes that this particular plant that you're looking at is resistant to that. F stands for fusarium wilt, which is a wilt disease of tomatoes. And then N stands for nematodes. If you see a variety, and again going back to Better Boy VFN, that means that that plant is resistant to verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, and nematodes. So if you've got issues with those diseases, that would be a good variety to grow in your area. Some other letter codes that you may see: T stands for tobacco mosaic virus. G stands for gray leaf spot. BSP stands for bacterial speck. TSW stands for tomato spotted wilt virus. And ASC stands for alternaria stem canker. So if you see any of those letters by the name of the variety, that means that it is resistant to that particular type of disease or issue that tomatoes run into. Now, I don't have time to talk about all of the possible diseases and pests and problems that we can run into with tomatoes, but let me talk a few minutes here about some of the major ones that we will see if we deal with growing tomatoes. There's a few diseases we need to be aware of. A couple of fungal diseases called early blight and late blight. These are leaf spot diseases that, if left to unchecked, can wind up killing the plant and deforming the fruit. Your best bet in controlling one of these diseases will be use a general purpose fungicide such as chlorothalonil, bacterial speck and bacterial speck and southern bacterial wilt are bacterial diseases. Unfortunately, we don't have any good pesticides for those diseases. Your best bet with that would be to cull your plants and use crop rotation to avoid getting that disease in the future. Viruses like tomato spotted wilt virus, there's not a whole lot we can do about that, but by controlling some of the insects that get into our tomatoes, we can reduce the chances of getting some of those viral diseases. As far as insects go, one of the major ones that we run into is tomato fruit worm. It gets into the fruit and starts eating it and causing the fruit to soften and to rot. That's one you need to be aware of. Stink bugs that feed on the fruit during the development cause deformed fruit, cat facing that we sometimes refer to it as. Colorado potato beetle can result in lack of vigor in the plants, as well as aphids and whiteflies. So those are just an example of a few insects that we run into with growing tomatoes. My advice to you, if you're having a problem with your tomato, is to contact our office to help you determine what that problem is and give you a recommendation on what to do about it. And that way in the future, you'll be ready for it. So if you have any issues with your tomatoes, that's what we're here for. You give us a call and contact the Cooperative Extension office, and we'll help you try to identify that issue. There are a few physiological problems I want to talk about that are not related to a pest or a disease that we need to be aware of. One of those is called radial cracking, and I don't have an example of that here with me today, but if you take a tomato and look at what we call the stem end of tomato, with this being the blossom end, this is the stem end where the tomato was picked off of the plant. You see cracks coming radially out from that stem bruise, that stem point. That's called radial cracking, and it is caused by heavy rains and high temperatures, and especially can happen after we've had a long dry spell and then get a lot of water. When that happens, that plant just bursts in growing, and it causes those cracking. That's called radial cracking. And the only way you can really deal with that is to make sure that you give it even watering and that you have a good amount of foliage on the plant to shade that fruit out from the full sunlight. And the only way to do that is just continue to do the things that we mentioned earlier about growing our tomatoes. Another type of cracking that we see that's the result of exposure to the sun when the tomato is green is called concentric cracking. Now, concentric cracking, again, if you look at the stem end of the tomato and you see circular cracking in concentric rings coming out there, that's called concentric cracking. And it is mainly the result of the fruit being exposed to the full sun. And the only way to deal with that, again, is to make sure you got good foliage cover, you got good water supply, uniform water supply. And then there is a tomato variety that is resistant to that type of cracking, and it's developed by NC State University called Mountain Pride. So Mountain Pride is a good variety for you to use in this area that is resistant to that type of cracking. The last problem I want to talk about is one of the major physiological issues and also one of the most complicated issues that we have with tomatoes, and that's called blossom end rot. Now, we usually see it in tomatoes, but you will also see it in pepper and sometimes in watermelon. But the short story is blossom end rot is caused by a lack of calcium in the fruit. And the way you know that you got that going on is if you look at the blossom end of the tomato, where it gets its name from, blossom end rot, there will be a black rotting that's leathery. It's not soft to the touch like a soft rot, but it's a leathery lesion on the end of the blossom end. That's due to the lack of calcium getting into the fruit. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have the calcium in the soil, There's a lot of different factors that play into whether that calcium is getting into the fruit like it should be. One of those is it could be absent in the soil, and not usually the case, but even if it is in the soil, if the pH is out of whack, if it's out of that 6.5 to 6.7 range in either way, that can contribute to the calcium not be taken up into the fruit. So one of the things that we highly recommend, going back to the soil test and having your soil tested and correcting that soil pH, goes a long way in reducing the blossom end rot issues. Of course, in addition to that, I mentioned earlier, in the absence of the soil test, if you would apply about a cup of lime to the planting hole when you plant these tomatoes, that will also help with the blossom end rot. But now there's other things that we have a lot of, it's not so much in our control that can contribute to blossom end rot. And one of those are extremes in temperature. And that can be extremes in cold as well as extremes in heat. And then extremes in water. So that we may be doing our irrigation properly, if we have a lot of water sometimes, that will also contribute to the blossom end rot. And blossom end rot is one of those things that you can have it even during one growing season. You can have it part of the season and not have it another part of the season. And if you continue growing, you might see it again. What it's dependent upon is what the conditions are during the production of that fruit. For example, your first set of fruit might be developing on the tomato plant when we've got cool nights. Well, if we've got cool nights, that can contribute to the blossom end rot problem with that group of fruit. Your next group of fruit that's produced on the plants, conditions at night may be just fine, and you may not have any blossom end rot with that. Now, next time a set of fruit that's produced, when it's developing, the night temperatures may be high, and if that's the case, then you may see blossom end rot, or if we have extremes in water, or extreme either too much or too little, that may also contribute to the blossom end rot, and you may have blossom end rot in that particular setting. So what can we do about blossom end rot? Take care of the things that we can take care of, such as correcting the soil pH, having even watering. You can also, in some cases, get some calcium nitrate fertilizer. Take about a tablespoon of that fertilizer and mix it in a gallon of water and spray that on your plants about 3 times a week. Will also help in reducing that blossom end rot. But the bottom line is there's so many variables that can contribute to blossom end rot. It's almost impossible not to have a little bit of it during your growing season. We just want to try to reduce it as much as we possibly can so that it's not a complete washout when we're growing our tomatoes. So with that, we have gone through the process of growing tomatoes, and then also talking about some of the issues that we may have with tomatoes and what to look out for. But let's just recap what we've got here. We want to make sure we have a proper location that we get plenty of sunlight and well drained where we plant our tomatoes. We want to have a soil test done and correct the pH if we can possibly do that prior to planting. Make sure that we have proper fertility, good even irrigation. Some cases we may want to use mulch to help out in reducing weed pressure. We want to support our tomatoes, get the plants off of the ground either through staking or caging. And we want to prune the suckers out according to whether we want large fruit or small fruit or lots of fruit. And then doing good pest control. These are the key factors to successful tomato growing. I encourage each and every one of you, if you've not grown tomatoes, to give it a try this year. If you've been growing tomatoes in the past. Hopefully some of the things we have pointed out today will help you. If you have any questions about growing tomatoes, don't hesitate to give me a call, 910-321-6871, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. And if you do venture into growing tomatoes this year, give us a call too and let us know what kind of success you have. With that, I appreciate your time today. Again, I'm Kenny Bailey, and I've been happy to talk to you today about growing homegrown tomatoes.